Hello, I'm Alistair McIntyre, the web publisher for the Electric Scotland websites, and this little video is actually about clans and families. When I do these kind of videos, I suppose what I'm really hoping for is that maybe a history professor might look at it and say, yes, we should be doing more research on the clans people. Or someone out there with particular knowledge will get in touch and say, hey, we got a really good article about our clan or our branch of a family, and send it in so we can publish it on the website. But to do that, I feel I need to go into some of the background of the clans and families so you'll understand where I'm coming to, and this is the purpose of this video. So clans and families. I think the first thing to note is that I'm sorry that we seem to be getting most of the books that are published about a clan are really following the chiefly line. And so we very rarely get any decent information on, like, the third son, for example, who may have joined the army. There's maybe an odd reference that he joined the army, but after that we know nothing. But he obviously would have got probably married, he may have had children, and so it'd be nice if we could have done a bit deeper look at the whole clan and the chiefly lines coming down. The other thing we get are septs of clans. And my understanding is that only the clan chief can state what other names should be septs of that clan. He's the only one that can make, or she is the only one that can make that decision. So someone that would come to me and said, hey, we should be a sept of that. Well, I'm not going to add him as a sept, not unless I get some definite information that it was the clan chief authorised that name to be added. If they did, fine, I'll add him in. Otherwise, they can go with other names associated with the clan. That's where there's not definitive proof that it's a sept. So, no problem in getting it added to other names that are associated with the clan, but if you want to be a sept, then it can only come from the clan chief. Or if that clan no longer has a chief, then clearly whatever sept list had when the chiefly line died out, that will be the list, and there's really no changing it. The other thing that on Electric Scotland I've tried to do is that I've tried to dig up as much information I can on basically all the clans, and also some prominent border families as well, which are a lot of people will also call the border clans. But it's quite time consuming to do that. I mean, I've made extensive use of the Internet Archive. But if you can think about it, if I put a name in, and it's a popular name, I can be offered thousands of books with that name on the title list. So to actually go through and try and see if there's anything in there to do, it's very difficult. What I usually would do, I would do a search for clan such and such, or family such and such genealogy, the kind of usual terms you might use. But that quite often I've found will still miss books, because I haven't gone through the 1,000 or 2,000 list of books to see if there was anything else mentioned if I just put the name in. And so I actually decided that I would pretty much continue to search until the name came out of the title, because when it was the title, then it became an author. And I mean, if you consider I've got to look for another 1,000 books where the name is only just in the author field, there's still a lot of work. So I really restricted myself to the title. But of course, the much larger task is to also search for the sept names. And if searching for the main clan names took several weeks, you could imagine searching for the sept names would take several months of work. I mean, I sometimes wish I had more helpers on Electric Scotland, because I could maybe then give one person a name and get them not only search for the name, but search for any septs associated with that name, and therefore break up the work amongst a considerable number of people. And I suppose that's one of my pleas, if there's anyone out there that does make use of the Internet Archive and are interested in a clan history, you might do that work for me. And then if you find anything, send me the URLs to all the books, and I'll certainly make sure that all that gets mentioned on the website. But also when it comes to SEPs, as I say, there's been no research done on them particularly, and I noticed one genealogist recently was bemoaning that fact. He said that whenever you write about the clan, they tend to follow the chiefly line, and so we lose the information on the more minor members of the chiefly line, and especially the girls that were born. I mean, who did they marry? And I often think that's one of the reasons that SEPs maybe came into being, in that if maybe the eldest daughter married someone that was fairly substantial, maybe the chief decided, well, that's now your name, I'm going to include that name within our SEP list. But it's interesting because I've talked to a number of clan chiefs, you know, and I think not one has been able to satisfactorily or give me information that would indicate they knew why each of the SEP names were associated with a clan. I think all of them knew why some were, but not all of the names that are listed as SEP, because they too, when their parent died, just accepted the list. And probably they didn't discuss maybe the SEPs within the family, so the knowledge of why that SEP was added has been lost in time. And that's why I believe that research needs to be done on that. The other area that we have problems with on searching for the names is just the spelling of names. And that is a whole minor nightmare. I mean, if you worked out that a person that emigrated from Scotland to America, for example, if they were a Gaelic speaker, and bearing in mind a lot of Gaelic speakers didn't read and write, Gaelic would tend to be a bit of an oral tradition. But so if they came over to America and someone said, okay, what's your name? And you said your name in Gaelic, the person that's taking down your details can't speak Gaelic, so he writes your name down as he believes it should be spelled, because you don't know how it's spelled. So he writes the name down, and you maybe get a copy of that paperwork, in which case all of a sudden you got a bit of paper that actually is the spelling of your name, and you think, oh, I'll hang on to that, because and that becomes the new spelling of your name, and that's what goes down in generations. But you also get the fact that even with that, the name may still change through several generations. I mean, there's plenty of anecdotes to show that people with an MAC often truncated to MC or even M apostrophe. And someone maybe knocked off, like Graham, might have been an E at the end, but over time they may be knocked off the final E. I mean, even in my own family there are imponderables. For example, my father's name, as I always knew it, was John Gilmore McIntyre. But when some genealogy was done on my father, they couldn't find a John Gilmore McIntyre. He just simply didn't exist. And of course there were a whole lot of John McIntyres. But eventually a genealogist that was just volunteered to do some search in my family eventually found out my father's name was just John McIntyre. But his mother's maiden name was Gilmore. And so what he decided to do in remembrance of his mother was to put her name as his middle name. But that was done unofficially. He just did it because he wanted to do it. But from my point of view, I always knew him as John Gilmore McIntyre. And even my mother was slightly different, because her name, as everyone knew it, was Sybil. But in actual fact, she actually said that her name was Isabel, but she didn't like the name for whatever reason, so she decided to call herself Sybil. So when she died, I knew she was Isabel, but then getting her death certificate organised, I also went to get her birth certificate, and in actual fact her first name was Isabella. Not Isabel, it was Isabella. So, I mean, even within the family I didn't know that. So, there are so many imponderables in searching. I usually suggest that when people come to my site and do a search for actual names, that what they should do is, if they don't find anything, is try speaking the name out loud and imagining how else you might spell that name. And it's amazing the number of times someone's emailed me to say that was a great tip, and because of it I actually found some information. So spelling is a big issue, so do think about that when you're searching. But when we come to clans and families, a lot of the accounts are actually fabulous accounts. I mean, a lot of them will tell you fabulous stories where the name came from and how you first got your lands and all that. I mean, I think you've got to take it with a little bit of pinch of salt, some of the stories anyway. But as I say, they concentrated on this chiefly line, so you never really learn very much about your individual, the individual clansmen and clanswomen, or their children for that matter. And that's where I think we should be delving much deeper, to try and find out, how did the chief go about looking after his clan? Because there's not actually a lot of discussion on that. You often hear reference to the fact that any clansman could go up to his chief and talk to him. But that would be quite natural, because the clans worked on the principle of working in a clan community, or a tribal kind of community. And so the chief being the head, his actual power came from the people that looked up to him, and people that he could bring into arms to fight for whatever cause he wanted them to fight for. So naturally it was in his interest, because that was like his richness, was the people, so he would naturally make himself open to talking to people of his clan. But they see the thing that worries me a bit is that, you know, we read about the Highland clearances, and a lot of the clan chiefs, when the people were no longer important, because he couldn't call them up in arms anymore, because he wasn't allowed to fight anymore. This is after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. So at that precise time, the people were of no longer of a value to the chief, other than could they produce money for him. And I must confess, I'm a little cynical these days. You know, a clan chief that basically threw his people off his land so he could put sheep in it, now seems quite keen to be back, now there's a few generations past, to bring his clan back together, so that they can get money together for him to visit them in America and Australia, New Zealand and Canada and wherever else, and perhaps contribute to building back up his castle and restoring it so he's got a nice place to live in. You see, I'm cynical here. I can quite understand people wanting to connect with their clan's people, but I do have a particular... I'm just a wee bit edgy on the fact that why would you particularly want to associate with a clan chief when his ancestors kicked you off the ground, you know, the land you've been in for generations? And then there's the whole story of the clan, because so often it was the clan chief that got the story of the clan written, and therefore it's perfectly natural that he'd want to minimize any nasty things and shall we say boost the story of any nice things. And I'm still quite amazed that even today I will get emails in from a variety of people saying, you've got the wrong history of the clan up. What we'd like you to do is take it down and put this new history up that we'll give you. She says, we're just trying to standardize it because there's so many bits that are contradictory. We just feel we want the true history up, so that's all there is the true history. But you see, in my view, that's censorship. Because no history is entirely factual. And I'm saying that because not only might they write something that's actually wrong, but by omission, they can also do a damage to the history. Because clearly if there was a really vicious, nasty incident, that's part of the history, but if you somehow make sure all these old histories go and the new history doesn't even mention it, then it's as if that nasty little incident never happened. And I think to understand the clans, we need to know about these nasty little incidents so we can take an overview on what life was like back in these days. And I say there is a certain romance about being a member of a Highland clan. And of course, most of the material you'll purchase are all to kind of give you that good feel about your clan. But if I told you that one clan decided on a feud with another clan to literally wipe them out, I mean, there is a factual story. They found this other clan on an island. They almost missed them, but just as they were going to depart, they suddenly spotted one of the clansmen that had popped up, obviously, to see if they'd left. And of course, because they spotted him, they knew they were over there somewhere. So they all rushed there. And what they found was that clan, men, women and children, were all hiding in a cave. So what did this other clan do? They got all the brushwood from the beach, stacked it up in the front of the cave, set it afire, so they burnt or suffocated men, women and children, and totally wiped that. I don't know whether it was a whole clan or a segment of a clan, but they wiped them all out. Even the kids. And then you read other stories which are pretty horrific, of how they've slaughtered other people and everything like that. I mean, this was not a pretty life by any manner. I mean, I don't see anything romantic about that. So I think when you look at a clan, you need to look at warts and all, and you need to, yes, you need to find out what are the good things they did, but also what the bad things were. And we need to know much more about how the people lived in these days. I mean, for example, it was usually, rather than and go to the lord that owned the land, you generally went to his taxman that was responsible for your area, and you dealt with the taxman and not the lord. And the taxman could be pretty brutal. They could also be very good. I mean, there's a whole mix from excellent to terrible. But it's like, you know, the taxman could demand 50 days work off you every year to do whatever he wanted you to do. He might also demand a share of your crop or something of that nature. And we don't know how much of that was normal and how much was extreme or how much was very kind. I mean, if you couldn't pay your rent, then perhaps paying it in kind was the way to go, either by giving part of your crop or by giving your services. And that's why we need to understand more about what the clan did and how they lived. And then the other problem we have is that the clan lands moved. Some clans took over other clan lands. Now, what happened to those clans people that were still there? Were they still associated with the old clan, or did they start to become associated with the new clan? And remember that names as such weren't used. I think 16th century backwards, there weren't names as such. So you tended to pick a name that was associated with your leader or something of that nature. And so we also need to understand how these clan names came about initially and how the people used their name in connection with the clan. You could say, oh yes, but we're all MacDonalds, but when did the name MacDonald come out? And how did all these individual clansmen come to with the name MacDonald? Were they actually related to MacDonald? Or were they just the people that lived on the clan lands and adopted the name? We don't actually know too much about that. And I think this is where the history professors need to dig deep and get a really good research project up. I mean, one of the problems, in all honesty, as I see with universities, is they may do some great research, but they're very jealously guard that research, and so they tend to only pass it on to other universities, and so the general public never get to know about the stuff they're producing. And when you find they've produced something and ask them if you can have a copy, they generally refuse. So I also sometimes question these history departments. I mean, I don't deal with the rest of the departments in universities, but history is obviously my area of expertise. But I do question these history professors. Why aren't they disseminating that information more? I mean, they will go out and give a talk to the favoured few in the group. But as to mass communications, they're back in the Stone Ages, is all I can say. And I really think they need to open themselves up. But basically, when you're looking at clans and families, as I say, it's a terrific story And of course, if you follow the Highland regiments were mostly clan-based. That's where you gathered your clansmen to make the regiment or battalion or whatever. It was usually going around your clan lands and getting the people to join up. And of course, the way they were brought up was very tough. I mean, it's a bit like I associate it today, in that when our first settlers came, like when I was doing the research on settlement, I particularly looked at Canada. And when they first came, they were given lands that were all forested. So to create a farm, they had to cut all the trees down. And while we can listen to the words today, in practical terms, that was viciously hard work. And I frankly think, on the whole, we're a very soft race these days in comparison to what they were like several centuries ago. And I think if we try to do what they did, the initial settlers, we'd probably have heart attacks, and we'd sprain ankles and arms, and I mean, we just couldn't do the same level of work as they did. So when you're brought up in a tough environment, and the Highlands was a tough environment, I mean, it could be absolutely stunningly beautiful, but you also got very harsh winters, and there was, I mean, because a lot of the Highlands is very lush, there's a lot of rain, raging torrents and burns and rivers and all kinds of things. So if you're traveling anywhere, you had to get through a river to get to the other side. It got soaked. I mean, that's actually where the kilt was actually very practical, because when you got over the other side, you dry your legs. Whereas if you're wearing trousers, it took a long time to dry the flannel of your trousers. So when you're researching your clan, by all means get the latest book. And I might add that a lot of the clan associations and societies are excellent vehicles to learn more about your clan. And certainly I would encourage you to join the society and help them with the work that they do. But get the book, but then start to ask questions. You know, what was it like? Where might I have lived? Because clearly the whole clan couldn't live in a castle. So the clan must have been dispersed around the lands. What were the lands like? And that's where it's sometimes difficult to get a picture. Because I don't know why, but I don't actually know off the top of my head of any clan association or clan society that has actually bothered to go and take pictures of the whole lands of the clan, so they could give you an idea of what they all looked like. And of course, a lot of these little clan villages are now gone. I mean, I'm putting up a book right now called Our Ain Folk. And it's basically the son of the Minister of the Manse who's written this book, and he's reminiscing about the old days. But what I thought was really sad was when he came to the very end of the book, his kind of final comments were that really all these buildings that were there are now no longer, or just look like rubble on the ground. The only saving grace in his particular case was that a new shepherd came to look after the lands, and he took an interest in them and wanted to know what places were called. But there was now no one in the area that remembered what these places were called. But luckily he found an old man that now lived far away from the areas that used to live there in the old days, and he invited the man to come and stay with him. And when the man came to stay, he was able to name, like, that's what that hill was called, that's what that river was called, that's what this burn was called, that's what this little hillock was called. He was able to give all the names. And thankfully the shepherd wrote it all down. And so when the Ordnance Survey went over that area, they now name all those little names that used to be in that area today. So for that little area, that's all been preserved. But there must be hundreds of those little villages where no record is now kept of that, of what, that they were even there. I mean, you get an odd reference when you're going through the histories of someone saying, you know, this land is now deserted, but it once held 7,000 people, but there's now no one left. You know, what has become of them? And the other thing you hear is, like, there was very much an oral tradition in Scotland. And so there were the storytellers that could tell stories that, I mean, they had to maybe even spend several nights telling the story. It was that huge. But they had prodigious memories in those days. And one sad story was one such storyteller emigrated to America. And all we know, he got there successfully, but died a few years later. But he had an immense store of these stories. But because they'd never been written down, all of those old stories were lost with him. I mean, today you think that's criminal. That just shouldn't happen. You know, we have to get those down. And as it happens, I've got about, I think, a 4-volume publication all about these old stories, because luckily there were 3 people in particular in the Highlands that took a great interest in the oral tradition and actually went to the trouble of actually getting the stories related to them, and they wrote them all down. And of course almost all of them were in Gaelic, so they also did translations as well. So these 4 volumes are basically translations of the original stories. And there must be thousands of stories that have been totally lost to us, and we'll never get them back. And that's really sad, because in the early days historians used to say, unless it's written down, it's not factual. We can't take cognizance of someone that just remembers something. But yet today, more historians are coming to the view that we need to take notice of those old oral stories. In fact, around the world today, there are, in fact, research projects on to get oral histories of the area, because people haven't bothered to write down the history, but they can remember the stories. I think when I was on Prince Edward Island, there was, I met one historian there, and I'm afraid I can't remember his name, but he was going to the 90-plus-year-olds in the area and sitting down with a tape recorder and getting them to talk into it to tell them the stories of the old days. That is a very valuable job of work. But of course, every year we don't do that is every year we lose another chunk of our history. And that's partly why I always plead that every family should try to note down salient facts in their history. And if they had a nice jotter or a file on a computer, when suddenly something triggers and they suddenly remember an old story that they were told by their grandmother, they might go to the computer and just quickly type that out while they remember it and save it. But then it's also important that whatever you save in your computer is also saved somewhere else. And I'm delighted to say that on Electric Scotland we have a number of people that have actually sent us their own family stories, so that not only is it on their computer, but we also retain a copy of that on our website. And I have made arrangements that my site will be preserved for future generations when I die. So none of the information on Electric Scotland is going to be lost. Unless, of course, the earth gets bombed to pieces and we have a Holocaust or something. But that's why I wanted to say clans and families, they're important because so many of us are associated with them. And it's good to know the stories by buying the appropriate books or looking at the old antiquarian books. But to me, there is so much more that we need to know. How did the people live in practical terms in these days? How did they all get their name of MacDonald? Were they really MacDonalds? Or were they just people that also lived in the area? These questions we need to ask. We need to dig deeper into septs, because that may reveal other connections with the clan. And we also have to remember that clans' lands changed. Some clans got more powerful and took over other lands, and obviously the opposite end was some clans got weaker. And so they lost land. So what happened? I mean, it's my belief that we really need 2 clan maps for every clan. One, the clan lands they own today, but also we need another, more complex perhaps, map to show the clan lands that they once owned. Because if you're doing genealogy research or looking for information, then if you knew they once owned these lands, then there must be some trace of that clan in those lands even today. So you need to know where they were if you're really doing some good research on the clan. So that's my basic story of clans and families. Don't believe everything you get, be prepared to question it, be prepared to dig for more information. And as I say, don't get fooled into believing just one story, because I can tell you, for every clan there's got to be hundreds of stories about the clan. And that might be from old pioneers that first came to America, because they must have talked to their grandparents, and some of them lived very long and may have actually had great-grandparents, and if while they were wee they listened at the knees of these great-grandparents, their stories must go way back, because they themselves may have been at the feet of their great-grandparents, so they could go back hundreds of years quite literally, just listening to the stories your parents tell you. And that's why I think it's so important that we note these things down before they're lost. And so many people say, well, I'm only an ordinary person, who the hell cares about me? But I suppose if you go right back to it, the whole world's a family. We all came from one source, probably. So, I mean, and just because maybe you're ordinary, you could still be extraordinary in a special way. I don't think anyone's actually ordinary. I think that, I mean, it's like trying to get information today. It's very, very difficult. It's like I'm saying to you, we want to better understand how people lived back then, maybe in the 18th century, during the Jacobite Rebellion period and before. And I mean, we're only talking 300 years back or something like that, 400 maybe. But I mean, if you think back in those days, we didn't have these beautiful big houses that they build today, which is probably the major expense all families have, is the family home. We didn't have a motor car, so we couldn't buy motor cars. We didn't even have bicycles, never mind motorbikes. We didn't have telephones. We didn't have computers. And to say with the big home theatres we have today, no televisions or anything back then. And no roads, no railways. So how did you get around? On your feet, basically. And I say there was just tracks, and these tracks were pretty rough. So if you did have a cart, you'd quite often break one of the wheels and have to fix it. I mean, getting around was not easy in these old days, so people tended to stay in a community. And I think they were much closer back in those days because of it. So it's trying to understand how you're related to other people in the area. Were they all clansmen together? Or were a lot of non-clansmen living in clan lands? I mean, these are questions that we want to know. So anyway, I won't go on, but all I can say is, if you're a member of a clan or a family, certainly be proud of that clan and family. Do read the histories, enjoy the histories, but I'd also ask you to be open and start looking at all of the information you get more critically. And that way you might dig deeper and find out little gems of information that previously you might not even thought of looking for. And of course, if you have any stories to tell or anything to find, please consider Lectures Scotland as your second home, and let us have articles we can publish on the site for everyone to share and enjoy. And I look forward to hearing from you on that front. Okay, take care of yourselves, look after yourselves. Goodbye.